Hello and welcome to American Friction, the podcast that doesn't really understand how money works or what it is. I'm Jacob Jarvis and my savings account is down.
And I'm Chris Jones and the only Bond I know is James.
But today, luckily, we have an expert to discuss the economic turmoil happening in America right now.
Mark Zandi is the chief economist of Moody's Analytics and the host of the Inside Economics podcast. And he joins us today on American Friction. Mark, thanks so much for being here because, frankly, we're lost when it comes to economics.
Well, we can be lost together. There's a lot going on. It's totally perplexing, confusing, completely out of bounds. But let's give it a shot.
Well, Mark, we're going to get into the US economy as it is today, which is very in flux, let's say. But objectively, how were things looking before Trump came into power?
Great. Economy was doing really. U.S. economy was, I think the word was exceptional that people were using, and I think it was appropriate. Lots of growth, lots of jobs, unemployment was low. We had a 4% unemployment rate, and that had been there for 3 years, low across every demographic. Stock market at record high, housing values at record high. We had our problems for sure, and we can talk about this if you'd like, but from a 30,000 foot level, it looked really good.
What were some of those problems then? Why did maybe some of the public interpret it as not being as good as it maybe does seem on a, as you say, on a wider view?
Prices. It was, prices for lots of things jumped during the pandemic. And when the Russians invaded Ukraine, as you know, is probably better than I, energy prices rose. So we're paying a lot more for gasoline and food and everything else. And even though prices had stopped rising as quickly, so inflation had slowed, people were still paying a lot more for groceries, for rent, for gasoline. Those are things that people need to buy, and it made them very upset. And, for many Americans, like many Europeans, hadn't seen inflation for generations. So most Americans just didn't know what this was and were taken by surprise. So I think it was mostly about the prices, the higher price levels.
So we're going to get into the tariffs and the broader chaos of Trump in a bit. But how did things change when Trump came in before the sort of all-out craziness? What were the sort of cashed-in Trump changes that we saw initially?
Well, there was a lot of changes all at once, everywhere.
Yeah,
big changes. I mean, the one change that was kind of on the front pages, so to speak, was the so-called DOGE cuts, Department of Government Efficiency. That's the Elon Musk endeavor. And that just has unnerved people because, people were getting fired, furloughed, then hired back. It was just, and still is to a large degree, just very chaotic. You use the word chaos. That's the appropriate word for it.
Yeah.
Government funding cuts have affected a wide range of businesses, private sector businesses. Nothing wrong with looking for government efficiency or rooting out fraud. Have at it. Those are all good things. But the way it was done was, you saw that image of Elon Musk with a chainsaw. That's exactly what it was. But that means you're breaking things that you shouldn't be breaking. And so I think Americans realize that. So that was front and center. But there's, all kinds of things, including obviously most importantly right now, the tariffs and the global trade war.
Well, let's talk about those tariffs now, shall we? And that really has been chaos. Just first of all, when these tariffs were introduced and we saw Trump hold up that board that made absolutely, it didn't make sense to me. I don't know if it made sense to you, Jarv.
No, not particularly.
When these tariffs came in, what was your immediate reaction? Were you shocked?
OMG. Over the top. Are you kidding me? Just the magnitude and just the, Mickey Mouse kind of formula used to calculate the tariffs across countries. It was just crazy. You guys made out okay, though, I guess, right? 10%?
Just about.
The lowest, I think it was.
Yeah,
so, yeah.
Poor Europeans, what were they at? 25%? I can't remember. Of course, now the Chinese are at 145%. So, it just complete surprise. Not that he was going to impose tariffs. He told us that point blank. He gave a great speech during the campaign at the Economic Club of Chicago, which ironically is where Jay Powell, the chair of the Fed, just gave his speech that just made President Trump very unhappy. But he told us he was going to raise tariffs, and he did it in a very clear, actually very cogent way. I don't use that word very often, but it was a very cogent way. So I wasn't surprised about the tariffs, just the magnitude and the haphazard nature of how they were being imposed.
Just with that, when that board came up, I mean, I looked at it and just figured, well, I'm not going to ever understand this. Like, some more clever people than me are going to have to work it out. You're one of those more clever people. When you saw it, how did you think, okay, how am I going to grapple with this? How did you come to terms with it and trying to make sense of something that entirely didn't make sense on the surface level?
Well, let me say, I've got you fooled. I don't know how much more I know than you, but well, when I saw that board, the first thing I thought, well, this is serious stuff, right? This isn't
Yeah.
high school geometry or something. I mean, social studies. This is, and I thought that was it's certainly not the way I would have done it, but okay. And then I'm looking at it, and there was no explanation of it at all. It hadn't been like, that was the other thing about this. No one was prepared for it. Usually when you make big policy announcements, you prepare
Yeah.
people, you call people up, you say, this is what I'm doing. Here's why I'm doing it. Here's the kind of talking points. Everyone has a clear understanding of what you're doing and why you're doing it. None of that happened here. So I'm looking at the board just like you, and I'm going, well, what do these numbers mean? Where are they coming from? What are they? And then, after the press conference was over, you got more information, and there was something that came out of the trade representative and Council of Economic Advisors. These are the organizations within the executive branch that help with making economic policy, especially around trade. And then you could see exactly how they came up with those numbers, and it was just really, I mean, just how I think Mickey Mouse is the right way to describe it. How Mickey Mouse it was. It was just loosely tied to the size of the bilateral trade deficits, which means nothing to anybody. So but became quickly clear that this was slapped together without much thought.
Not to give too much credit to Trump and his administration over this, but do you think that was as if there was a plan? Do you think that this was part of the plan, that it was meant to be confusing to everyone, and therefore no one could really get into it too much because no one really understood where the numbers came from, and therefore they just hoped that because there was so much going on. I mean, you've described it already in this earlier on in this podcast, that so much has been happening that this would just eventually kind of get buried amongst the rubble. Do you think that was partly a plan, that people would just kind of move on from it?
Well, look how that's worked out for them.
Yeah.
It's been real great. Maybe, I don't know. I think you're overthinking this big time.
Yeah, I think I probably am. Yeah.
Plan is definitely not the word. It's put your finger in the sky. I mean, it is his negotiating style. I mean, historically, to ask for a lot more and then negotiate down to something else, maybe, but it's creating a whole lot of damage. And because just simply that strategy, the uncertainty of it all, even if he didn't raise the tariffs, just the on again, off again, is doing a lot of damage to the economy, and not in just the U.S. economy, global economy, but not just in the near term, longer run as well, because this is really beginning to tarnish the safe haven status of the United States. People are saying, well, you guys are just, you used to be the source of stability. Now you're the source of instability. You're the problem, and you're not money good anymore. You're not AAA. And that giving that up, and literally just giving it up, is going to be incredibly costly for generations to come.
I wanted to ask you a little bit more about that, Mark, the safe haven status, and with that slipping. Could you explain to me a little bit, like I'm a complete beginner here, what that means and why it's so important? And is that also, to your mind, is that one of the broader issues here for America, is that the nuts and bolts are going to change and numbers are going to go up and down, but the way people feel about America might actually be one of the most important things that Trump is damaging?
Yeah, totally. You nailed it. I mean, the safe haven status is just bottom line. We pay lower interest rates than everybody else in the world because particularly during times of crisis, when people are scared, the financial crisis or the pandemic, or, things happen, every 5-10 years, you get into a real scrape, and people are really scared to go into what market investors call a risk off environment. So if you're an investor, a big global investor, you're a pension fund, insurance company, sovereign wealth fund, whatever, a family office, whatever it is, you want safety. You want to put your money in a place in an asset that is what I called money good. You put your money there, you're getting your money back, and you're going to get your interest on time, no questions asked. Nothing to worry about. That was the United States of America. So when times got bad, money comes pouring into the U.S. and that makes it a lot easier to navigate through the troubles because we have a lot of capital and interest rates are down, and it's easier to get funding than the rest of the world. But that's getting blown to smithereens by all this because people are saying, well, the key to that safe haven status is that your investments can't be affected by the capriciousness of government action, right? It's the rule of law. It's independent of decisioning by a government, particularly one person sitting in the government, and which even makes it more nerve-wracking. So that's not the case, obviously now, and maybe things will change in the future. I hope so, but right now and for the foreseeable future, we're left with this completely upended environment, and the real questions around the safe haven status, and we're going to pay higher interest rates. And just to strike that point home, the U.S. has $30 trillion in debt, government debt. That's not including household debt, corporate debt, government debt, $30 trillion. Soak that in for a second. $30 trillion. That's the size of the American economy, GDP. You pay 1 basis point more, 0.0001, and you just do the arithmetic, over a decade or two, that's a lot of healthcare you can't provide. That's a lot of cleanup you can't do when a hurricane hits. That's a lot of defense you can't do. You're undermining your ability to provide the services that the world and the population needs. And again, the thing about it is, it's not like it was taken. It was like we're giving it away.
Globally, are there other countries that are looking to move into that safe haven space? Are there other countries that even can move into that? And what would that mean, for America if, say, I don't know, a China were to become somewhere which was seen more like a safe haven compared to America?
Yeah, I mean, that's what's saved the U.S. for quite some time. It's like, who's the better risk? There's risk everywhere, including now in the United States, but still, the U.S. is less risky than everywhere else on the planet. Even that's coming under, some question in the current context. In places like Europe, I mean, the euro is appreciated in value quite strongly. Pound is up a bit. The yen is up.
Yeah.
The yuan, the Chinese currency, less so because they've got their own kind of issues with regard to the rule of law and capriciousness of government. You've got, again, one guy who can make a decision and change everything for you. And I don't think investors are very comfortable with that. And the other thing about China is that the flows of money can be easily controlled. The Chinese have been willing and have stopped money coming in and coming out. And that you really don't want to, if you're an investor, you don't want that. You want the ability to get your money in and out, with the stroke of a computer button. So that's the thing that's going to make sure that the safe haven status of the United States doesn't completely fall apart. But it's an erosion. It's corrosive, and over time, I think places like Europe are going to take on more of that safe haven status role.
Just to round off on the tariff chat before we move on a little bit to something else. Trump famously said that there were countries that were coming to him and kissing his ass for deals. Now we've seen this pause in place for 90 days. What are we going to see for the next couple of months or so? Are we going to see more kissing of asses, or what? What really happens now there is this pause in place, or do we don't know?
We don't know. Think about scenarios. How does this all play out? I attach probabilities to those scenarios. I think the most likely scenario is that the U.S. starts cutting "quote unquote" deals with other countries, and it doesn't really matter whether they're real deals or they're just performative. More likely, they're just performative, but that would provide a way to declare victory, and move on and get to something else. I'm hopeful that's the way this goes, that the Trump administration takes that off ramp here. And so, strike a deal with Japan. They're probably most likely, just because they're most likely to negotiate or sit down and discuss. Everyone's having a great deal of difficulty doing this, though, because it's not clear what the Trump administration wants. If you listen to Japanese officials in public discourse, they're saying, we just don't know what are we negotiating? What do you want?
Yeah.
So it's not clear, but I think that's the way this will go. There is though a high probability scenario where more countries, Europe goes the way of China and says, look, I don't think this is going to work out. First of all, I can't figure out what you want. Second of all, what makes you think you're not going to come right back at me a year from now when you're upset about something else? And by the way, I'd count on that. If you cut a deal, that it's not a deal for life; it's a deal for for that moment in time. So
Yeah.
it's not going away. And they may decide I'm going to fight this thing. I'm going to do a China, exact more pain on the United States, and force a de-escalation. Again, President Trump's very good at pivoting and declaring victory, and some way, somehow, that's what I expect to happen here. It's just a question of how much pain the U.S. and the world have to suffer before that actually happens.
Right, let's talk recession, because it's a word that's been bounded around a lot. You said earlier in April, I think that there was a 60% chance that the US could enter a recession. Do you still think it's around that mark, or do you think it's even more or even less?
Yeah, I don't mean to imply a high level of precision here.
No, we're holding you to it exactly.
It's the most direct, simple way to communicate the level of concern that economists have. Everyone can get their mind around what that means pretty quickly. It's over 50%. So that's not good.
No,
even if we're close to 50%, that's not good. But we're over 50%. That's not good. That's not good. Yeah. With each passing day, I'm growing more nervous that they're not taking the off ramp. They're not cutting a deal. They're not looking for a way out. And it's going to do more and more damage. And, the thing is, all of this has happened with the tariffs actually only recently being implemented, and prices have not even risen yet. It hasn't happened yet. What we're all thinking about is still ahead of us. So once prices start rising, and believe me, they will. I mean, those Chinese goods that have to pay 145% tariff. And there's going to be shortages because some things just aren't going to it's just prohibitively expensive to actually produce and sell it here because of the tariffs. That's when, people are going to say, oh my gosh, and start cutting. And that's a recession when consumers start pulling back.
Mark, recession does seem like a big word that could kind of mean all sorts of different things in practicality. So, say more of an existential question, I suppose, but what sort of recession does it look like it could be?
Well, of course, that goes to exactly the tariffs, how high, how long, which countries, what's the retaliation. You can construct some very, very. I constructed a recession scenario for you. I can construct some very dark scenarios. The higher the tariffs go, the longer they stay there, the more the retaliation, the deeper the recession. And I think obviously it's a global problem, right? It's not just the U.S. The two largest economies on the planet, the U.S. and China, together account for, I'm making this up, but 45% of global GDP, almost half of GDP. And those two countries are literally going at it. There's a swinging away, in a metaphorical sense around the economy, and everyone's going to get hurt here. It's just a level of how much pain we're going to suffer.
Trump is railing against Jerome Powell at the moment. Could you talk me through who Powell is, why he matters so much, and why there is the friction between them?
So you have the Bank of England. We have the Federal Reserve. Powell is the chairman of the committee that operates interest rate policy, monetary policy at the Federal Reserve. And President Trump wants Chair Powell to cut interest rates. He's saying, look, he knows this trade war is going to hurt the economy. It's going to hurt growth. It's going to be more potential job loss, higher unemployment if we get into recession. And he wants the Fed to cut interest rates. Also, to some degree, it's assessing blame. If things go off the rails and Chair Powell hasn't cut interest rates, you can pretty much guess who's going to get the blame for this, or at least someone's going to try to put the blame on him. But Chair Powell is appropriately reluctant to cut interest rates. First of all, he's independent, as he should be. He has not the executive branch and nor should it have any input into the process, because when that happens, you always end up with interest rates too low for too long because that's in the best interest of the executive branch, the president, and you end up with high inflation and ultimately a recession anyway. So he wants his independence. But more importantly, the thing about tariffs that are so pernicious, particularly from his perspective, is it raises inflation, right? The tariffs are a tax in the form of higher prices for the goods that you buy.
Yeah.
That means you, all else equal, you would raise interest rates, right? Because you want to make sure inflation is so-called low and stable. But you do have the backside of that is slower growth because it's a tax, it's effective tax, it slows consumer spending and investment, and you get a recession. And all else equal, that would argue for cutting interest rates. So you're in between and betwixt. You don't know what to do, particularly in the current context, because these tariffs are all over the map. They're on again, off again. You don't know how high, how long, when, what, so forth and so on. So President Powell said, I'm going to sit on my hands. I'm just not going to move until I get clarity around what's going on and whether I've contained inflation. That's my number one priority. And of course, that made the president very upset because, again, he wants lower interest rates regardless. That's the kind of the story behind why we're in the middle of this pitched battle between the president and the chairman of the Federal Reserve.
On control of America's finances, again, I mentioned this to you before we start recording. I'm an idiot when it comes to economics and how the government can interfere and how it can control things. What kind of, I guess, checks and balances? What is in place to make sure that the government, or Trump in this specific example, can't just essentially do whatever he wants in terms of economy and putting in policies that could be damaging to just normal everyday Americans?
Well, as it turns out, very few guardrails. He's testing all of the boundaries between the branches of government, and they're all going to the courts, into the court system. So even the tariffs may be illegal. The tariffs are being done under certain laws. It's not clear that the laws are being applied appropriately. That's a legal question. I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah.
But it is in the court system, and we could find out 6, 9, 12, 18 months from now that they're illegal and they have to be dropped. And then the question is, will he drop them? So it's the same issue across everything that's going on here. In the U.S. is they're testing the boundaries now.
Yeah.
Another potential governor, and this is probably more important most immediately, is financial markets. Financial markets are, when I say that, I mean the stock market.
Yeah.
I mean the foreign exchange market. And I mean the bond market where interest rates are determined. Those are investors making bets on how things are going to go, and they're betting that things aren't going at all well. The U.S. stock market's down. It's between 15 and 20%, depending on the day and the hour. Long-term interest rates have been rising, which is incredibly, going back to the safe haven status, atypical. They should be falling in a risk-off environment. The value of the dollar is declining. So investors are voting and saying, I think those economists have it right. This is really bad for business, and I don't like it. So I'm going to sell bonds. And interest rates go up. I'm going to sell stock. I'm going to sell the U.S. dollar. And I think ultimately that will be the guardrail, the governor. I think that sort of happened in his first term, too. He went down this trade war path on a much smaller scale, and that didn't work out at all either. And financial markets threw up all over it. And, he found that exit ramp, that off ramp that we were talking about.
Yeah.
And I'm hopeful that's the case here. I think that's the guardrail. I don't think it's going to be Congress. I don't think it's going to be certainly not anytime soon, the courts.
Just on inflation as well, I wanted to ask you about this because this was such a massive marker of Trump's campaign, his election campaign, that he was gonna fight inflation and he was gonna make everything better basically immediately. And the public seemed, if you look at the polling leading up to the election, they seemed to believe that, or a certain bracket of the public seemed to believe that, and also seemed to believe that he would handle the economy better than Biden was. Do you think it already has, or when do you think it will click with this same bracket of people that Trump isn't doing well for the US economy, and actually he appears to be making things a lot worse but also he's doing it blindly as well.
Yeah, there's some evidence that's happening. If you look at various surveys, polls, ask the question: how's the president doing on the economy in his first term and up through, let's say, March? He would do well. His over 50% of the folks responding said he's handling the economy well. Well, now it's well below 50%. So people are questioning his stewardship of the economy. And again, that's before anything really has happened. It's before the prices have started to rise. It's before we start losing jobs. It's before unemployment started to rise. So you can, the direction of travel here is clear. If that happens, then I think the assessment of the U.S. American population around his stewardship of the economy and everything else will be in question. And maybe that's another guardrail. I think I'm not saying anything he doesn't know. So, maybe that would be a reason for him to, figure out how to stand down, declare victory, and move on.
On what Trump and his team do know. So looking at some things that Trump's doing, you look at some of the Project 2025 related tactics he's taking, and it seems like he and his team and the people around him do know how things work, and they want to break those things, and they want to shift away from them or do them different ways or use the system to get different ends in whatever way. When it comes to the economy, do you think the Trump team does have the expertise to know what's going on? How much of this is deliberate and they want to break the system, or how much of it is just a lack of knowledge of what their actions will cause?
It's mixed. There's a group that wants to change things dramatically, break things, believing that that's going to end in a better place. Their views fly against, all reasonable thinking, in my view. I mean, you could put 100 economists in a room and you can ask them about the tariffs and trade war and say, is that a good idea or a bad idea, in the long run? I'd say 98 of them would tell you that's a really, really bad idea. You can find 2. I'm not sure where they are, maybe in the administration, but they're there somewhere.
Yeah.
You know how unusual that is? If you ask that 100 economists any other question about any other issue, you're going to get about 3,000 different opinions. I mean, it's never that way. This is uniform. But there's a group that, they drunk the Kool-Aid, believe the rhetoric, and are going down the path. Then you've got a group that they're smart people. They know what they're doing. They're just kind of it's hard for them to navigate. This is my armchair kind of observation. I don't know, but my sense is I know who these people are. I know them well. My sense is that they've been kind of effectively neutered. If you have to be very careful, I think, in any administration, you have to play politics and make sure if you have a different view that you express it in a way that isn't counterproductive. And I think they're finding it hard to express that view. Now, at times they shine through, like Secretary Bessent looks like he kind of took over here in the wake of the so-called reciprocal tariffs when that upended the markets a couple of weeks ago. He kind of stepped in and it felt like he took control. So, they've been able to have some impact, but, they certainly not enough of an impact to turn this thing around, at least not yet.
You previously on another podcast, you said that some of what's going on reminds you of Groundhog Day. What made you think that some of the political situation was like Groundhog Day? But also, if we could liken what's happening to any sort of film now, have you got any comparisons there? Is it more of a horror movie at this point?
I don't remember saying that. I don't know. I'm not sure. I love Groundhog Day. Have you seen the movie? It's a great movie.
Yeah.
It's one of my favorite of all time. Maybe I was referring to the fact that every 100 years we go down this watch my language, this tariff path. The last time we did this was 1930, Smoot-Hawley. That didn't work out well for anybody. That ended in the Great Depression. Then I know I'm going way back, 100 years back to 1828, Tariff Act of 1828, Andrew Jackson. That didn't work out at all well either.
Yeah.
I think it takes 100 years for everyone to die, and forget. And the next crop come along and say, oh, this seems like a good idea. Let's try that. And the way this thing is going so far, it'll all be the same thing. It'll take another 100 years before we go down the tariff path again.
Yeah, let's hope not. Let's hope this is the last time. But Mark, thanks so much for joining us and bringing us up to date on the economics of it all. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely. And the other movie, Ferris Bueller's Day Off. That's the other one that's really good, and it talks about Smoot-Hawley. So you might want to, if you haven't seen that, take a look at that one too.
Nice. We'll dive into it.
Dive in.
Mark, thanks again. And listeners, thanks to all of you for listening to American Friction. Remember, if you want to help us keep making the show, you can back us on Patreon to get shows ad-free, extra bits, and merch. Search American Friction Podcast Patreon, or there's a link in the show notes. I'm Jacob Jarvis.
And I'm Chris Jones.
Thank you for listening to American Friction.